The Montana wind did not simply blow that night, it howled like something alive. Inside a weather-beaten cabin buried deep in the Bitterroot wilderness, Michael sat alone, staring into the fire as if it owed him answers. The flames flickered across the scar that cut down the left side of his face, a permanent reminder of a war he thought he had left behind. He had come to these mountains to disappear. No neighbors, no phone signal, no past, only silence. But silence in the mountains is never empty. It started as a faint thud against the cabin door. Not a knock, not the wind. Something desperate, something alive. Michael froze. Out here in the dead of winter, visitors did not exist. The sound came again, claws scraping wood, followed by a heavy collapse. When he finally unbolted the door, the storm exploded inside. Snow and wind tore through the cabin like an invading army. And there on the threshold lay a German shepherd, massive, half frozen, its fur soaked with blood. The dog tried to lift its head. Then it collapsed at his feet. Michael had seen that look before. It was the look of something that had escaped hell, and hell was coming. His pulse quickened as he moved his hands further down the dog's flank. There was another injury, a deep, jagged laceration that looked suspiciously like a knife's edge had been dragged through the skin. This animal hadn't been hunted by a predator of the forest. It had been hunted by a man. The dog let out a low, pained whimper as Michael touched a particularly sensitive spot, its tail giving a single pathetic thump against the floor. It was a plea for help, a desperate trust placed in the hands of a stranger. Michael stood up and moved quickly to his medical kit, the one he kept stocked with trauma supplies that most civilians wouldn't know how to use. As he gathered gauze, antiseptic, and a surgical needle, his mind raced. A dog like this, well-fed, highly disciplined even in its delirium, and wearing a high-grade tactical harness, didn't belong to a casual hiker. This was a working dog, a professional, and the fact that it had been shot suggested something far more sinister than a hunting accident. He worked with a grim efficiency, his hands moving with the practiced grace of a field medic. He flushed the wounds, the scent of antiseptic mixing with the iron smell of fresh blood. The dog remained remarkably still, its head resting on Michael's knee, its eyes tracking his every movement with a haunting intelligence. It was as if the animal knew that this man was its only hope between life and the cold darkness waiting outside. Michael spoke to it in a low, gravelly hum, a series of nonsense words meant to soothe the same way he used to talk to his younger brothers in the dark when the world felt too big. As he stitched the laceration on the dog's side, he noticed something tucked into a small, waterproof pouch on the side of the tactical harness. His fingers brushed against a hard, rectangular object. He paused, his heart thudding against his ribs. Slowly, he unclipped the pouch and pulled out a small, encrypted data drive and a crumpled piece of paper. The paper was stained with water and a single drop of blood. On it, written in a frantic, shaky hand, were 3 words that made the hair on the back of Michael's neck stand up. They are coming. The silence of the cabin suddenly felt fragile, like thin ice over a deep lake. Michael looked at the dog, then at the darkened windows, where the blizzard continued to lash against the glass. The dog wasn't just a stray seeking warmth. It was a courier, and whatever it was carrying, people were willing to kill for it. Michael looked back at the door, the heavy iron bolt suddenly seeming far too thin to keep the world out. He realized then that the peace he had spent years building was an illusion. The war had found him, and this time there was no extraction team coming to save him. He stood up and walked to the corner of the room, reaching behind a stack of firewood to pull out a heavy, locked Pelican case. He punched in the code, the mechanical clicks echoing in the room. Inside lay his old service rifle, a black, matte-finished tool of destruction that he had promised himself he would never need again. He checked the chamber, the metallic slide of the bolt sounding like a death knell in the quiet cabin. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but as he looked at the dog shivering on his rug, he knew he couldn't turn it away. The storm outside roared with renewed fury, but Michael no longer heard the wind. He was listening for something else, the sound of engines, the crunch of boots on frozen snow, or the click of a safety being disengaged. He looked at the dog, which had now closed its eyes, its breathing finally evening out into a deep, healing sleep. Michael sat back down on the floor next to the animal, his rifle resting across his lap, his eyes fixed on the door. The night was far from over, and the guest of the storm had brought more than just blood into his home. It had brought a reason to fight. A silent veteran and a tortured messenger are bound by blood and survival. But as Michael uncovers the horrific marks of systematic cruelty on his new companion, he realizes the dog isn't just a victim, he is a survivor carrying a desperate plea for those still trapped in the dark. The orange glow of the hearth cast long dancing shadows against the cedar-planked walls of the cabin, but the warmth offered little comfort to Michael. His dining table, a heavy slab of oak he had built with his own hands, had been transformed into a makeshift operating theater. The smell of old wood and dried herbs was now drowned out by the sharp, sterile sting of isopropyl alcohol and the heavy metallic scent of fresh blood. Michael's movements were rhythmic and practiced a muscle memory born from a dozen muddy trenches and sterilized field hospitals in lands the world had chosen to forget. He had laid the dog, whom he now called Tom, on a clean white sheet, though the fabric was rapidly blooming with crimson flowers. Michael's large, calloused hands, scarred from years of handling steel and gunpowder, moved with a gentleness that seemed almost alien to his rugged frame. He reached for his old military-grade IFAK individual first aid kit and began to lay out the tools of his former trade: hemostatic gauze, a curved suture needle nylon thread, and a bottle of medical-grade antiseptic. Every breath Michael took was steady, a deliberate effort to keep the ghosts of the past at bay. As he began to shave the fur away from the deepest gash on Tom's flank, his jaw tightened. This wasn't a wound from a jagged branch or a territorial scrap with a wolf. This was a clean, high-velocity puncture. A bullet had grazed the animal, tearing through muscle, but miraculously missing the bone. Michael poured the antiseptic directly into the wound. The dog's body gave a violent, involuntary shudder, a low whine escaping its unconscious throat. But Michael held him down firmly, his voice a low, gravelly hum that served as a makeshift lullaby. It was when Michael moved to stabilize the dog's rear legs that he saw them. He stopped the suture needle frozen in midair. He reached for a flashlight, clicking it on to cut through the amber haze of the firelight. Around both of Tom's back ankles, the fur was missing, replaced by thick, raised rings of keloid tissue. These weren't accidental injuries. These were the unmistakable, jagged marks of heavy iron shackles that had been worn for a long, long time. The skin was scarred and pitted, showing signs of old chemical burns and the rhythmic, cruel application of electricity. A cold, familiar rage began to simmer in the pit of Michael's stomach. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in years, the icy, focused anger of a predator who had found the trail of something truly monstrous. He recognized these marks. He had seen them on prisoners of war, in black site cells, on victims of human trafficking rings in Eastern Europe. To see such calculated professional cruelty inflicted upon an animal suggested a level of depravity that Michael knew all too well. This dog hadn't just escaped a bad owner. He had escaped a nightmare. He worked for another hour, his fingers dancing through the silver-threaded sutures, closing the gaps in the flesh with the precision of a master tailor. He cleaned the chemical burns and applied a soothing salve, his mind racing through the implications of what he was seeing. Who would go to such lengths to restrain an animal, and why was the dog carrying an encrypted drive? The pieces of the puzzle were jagged and bloodstained, and they didn't yet fit together, but the picture they were forming was one of imminent violence. As the blizzard outside reached a crescendo, rattling the window panes in their frames, the dog's breathing shifted. The ragged, wet gasps smoothed out into a deeper, more conscious rhythm. Michael sat back on a low stool, wiping the blood from his hands with a damp rag. He watched as Tom's ears twitched. Then slowly the dog's eyes blinked open. They were not the cloudy, panicked eyes of a dying animal, but a piercing, intelligent amber. The dog didn't growl. He didn't snap. He looked at Michael with a gaze that felt unnervingly human, a look of recognition and profound sorrow. For a long moment, man and beast simply stared at one another, two souls forged in the same fire of suffering. Michael reached out his hand, hovering for a second before he let it rest gently on the dog's head. Tom didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned his weight into Michael's palm, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had just been sealed in the quiet of the storm. But the peace was short-lived. Tom's head suddenly snapped toward the heavy oak door. He tried to stand his legs, trembling violently, his bandaged wounds beginning to weep fresh spots of pink through the white gauze. He let out a sound that wasn't a bark, but a desperate guttural howl that vibrated through the floorboards. He collapsed back onto the table, his front paws scrambling for purchase, trying to drag his weakened body toward the exit. Michael stood up, placing his hands on the dog's shoulders to keep him from tearing his stitches. "Easy, Tom. Easy. You're not going anywhere in this storm." The dog ignored the command, his eyes fixed on the door, his body quivering with an urgency that was bordering on frantic. He began to whimper a high-pitched, soul-piercing sound that Michael had heard before, the sound of a soldier who refused to leave a comrade behind. Tom looked at Michael, then back at the door, then nudged Michael's hand with his snout, pushing it toward the north. He let out a low, mournful moan, his gaze directed toward the dark, frozen expanse of the forest that lay beyond the cabin's walls. Michael looked at the door, then back at the amber eyes of the dog. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The dog hadn't been running for his own life. He was a scout. He was a messenger who had barely made it through the lines to deliver a warning. The scars on his legs were the proof of where he had come from, and his desperation was the proof of what he had left behind. There was someone else out there, someone who couldn't run as fast as Tom, someone who was still in the hands of the people who used iron shackles and electricity. The encrypted drive, the "they are coming," note the bullet wounds. It wasn't just about a dog. It was about a massacre waiting to happen in the frozen heart of the woods. Michael looked at his rifle leaning against the wall, its black finish cold and indifferent. The silence of the cabin was gone, replaced by the loud, thumping heartbeat of a man who realized his war wasn't over. It was just beginning. The dawn over the Montana wilderness did not arrive with a warm embrace, but with the cold, surgical precision of a blade. The sky was a pale, translucent indigo, fading into a bruised gold along the jagged teeth of the Bitterroot Range. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of pine resin, dried blood, and the metallic tang of gun oil. Michael sat at the heavy oak table, his large hands wrapped around a tin mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. He stared at the frosted window pane, watching the way the ice crystals formed intricate fractal patterns that looked like topographical maps of a war zone he had tried to forget. Beside him, Tom was no longer the broken creature that had collapsed on his doorstep. The German shepherd stood rigid, his frame tense as a coiled spring. His ears were pinned forward, twitching at the infinitesimal sounds of the waking forest, the snap of a frozen branch, the distant cry of a hawk, the rhythmic shiver of the wind against the eaves. Every few minutes, Tom would approach Michael, his cold snout nudging Michael's calloused palm with a persistence that was impossible to ignore. When Michael didn't move, the dog let out a low, vibrating growl from deep within his chest, then turned to pace toward the heavy timber door, his claws clicking like a metronome on the floorboards. The dog stopped at the threshold, his body silhouetted against the sliver of light peeking through the doorframe. He looked back at Michael, his amber eyes burning with an intelligence that was hauntingly human. It wasn't a plea for food or a walk. It was a tactical report. Tom was waiting for his commander to acknowledge the reality of the situation. The wounds on the dog's flanks were still fresh, the white gauze Michael had applied the night before, now stained with small blooms of pink, but the animal seemed to have discarded the concept of pain. He was a soldier on a deadline, and his commander was hesitating. Michael felt the familiar weight of the past pressing down on his shoulders. He looked at his hands, scarred, steady, and capable of terrible things. He had come to these mountains to bury the man he used to be, to trade the thunder of mortar fire for the silence of the pines. But as he watched Tom's frantic urgency, he realized that the silence was an illusion. The world he had fled had followed him here, carried in the fur and blood of a stray dog. The "they are coming" note on the kitchen counter seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. If he stayed, he was a sitting duck. If he left, he was stepping back into the fire. With a heavy sigh that ghosted in the freezing air, Michael pushed the chair back. The screech of wood against wood sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. Tom immediately stopped pacing his tail, giving a single sharp wag, not of joy but of mission commencement. Michael walked toward the back of the cabin, where a heavy rug covered a trapdoor in the floor. He pulled it back, revealing a reinforced steel locker. The combination lock turned with a series of muffled clicks. As the door swung open, the dim light caught the matte black finish of a customized Remington 700 bolt-action rifle and a weathered tactical rucksack. He pulled out a pair of heavy wool socks and a set of thermal layers, dressing with the mechanical efficiency of a man who had done this 1,000 times in the dark. Every movement was deliberate. He laced his combat boots tight, feeling the familiar support around his ankles. Next came the leather jacket, an old scuffed piece of hide that smelled of wood smoke and a decade of rain. He checked the magazine of his sidearm, a Sig Sauer P226, the slide racking with a crisp, lethal sound that echoed through the cabin. He holstered the weapon at his hip, the weight of it feeling like a long-lost limb finally restored. Tom watched every movement, his head tilting as Michael packed the rucksack. Extra ammunition, a first aid kit, a thermal blanket, and a handful of protein bars. Michael looked at the dog who was now standing by the door, his posture low and ready. "You know what's out there, don't you, Michael?" whispered his voice raspy from disuse. Tom let out a short, sharp bark, a sound of affirmation that cut through the tension. Michael slung the rifle over his shoulder and grabbed his gloves. He took one last look around the cabin, the warm hearth, the half-read book on the nightstand, the life he had tried to build. He knew that when he stepped out that door, that life was over. He was no longer Michael the Hermit. He was the ghost the government had spent millions to train. "Lead the way, boy," Michael said, his voice hardening into a tone of command. As Michael cracked the door open, the Montana winter rushed in like an invading army. The air was so cold it burned his lungs, but it cleared the last of the fog from his mind. Tom didn't hesitate. The dog leaped off the porch, his paws sinking into the pristine snow, but he didn't head for the established hiking trails or the dirt road that led to the nearest town. Instead, he veered sharply to the north toward the Shadow Valley, a place of jagged limestone cliffs and ancient tangled cedar groves where the sun rarely touched the ground. They moved in silence, a grim procession of two. Michael watched Tom's movement with a professional eye. The dog wasn't just running, he was scouting. He would move 50 yards ahead, stop scent the wind, scan the ridgeline, and then signal for Michael to advance with a subtle movement of his head. It was a flawless display of tactical movement that confirmed Michael's darkest suspicions. This dog hadn't been trained by a hobbyist. He was a product of a K9 program designed for high-stakes extraction and deep cover operations. The terrain became increasingly hostile. They climbed over fallen gargantuan pines, their bark slick with black ice. They navigated narrow ledges, where a single slip would mean a 100-foot drop into a frozen creek bed. The wind began to howl, whipping the snow into blinding eddies, but Tom never faltered. He led Michael deeper into the wilderness, away from any hope of rescue, toward a destination known only to the beast and the shadows. Michael's heart hammered against his ribs, not from the physical exertion, but from the rising tide of adrenaline. His senses were hyper-tuned. He could hear the rustle of a squirrel 100 yards away. He could smell the faint, ozone-heavy scent of an approaching storm. He realized then that he wasn't just following the dog. He was hunting. The instinct that had been dormant for 5 years had roared back to life, hungry and sharp. They reached the crest of a ridge that overlooked a deep, bowl-shaped canyon. Tom suddenly dropped to his belly, crawling the last few feet to the edge of the precipice. Michael followed suit, the cold snow soaking into his trousers as he slid into position beside the dog. He pulled his binoculars from his jacket and scanned the valley floor below. At first, there was nothing but the monochromatic blur of trees and snow. But then a flash of something unnatural caught his eye. A glint of sunlight on glass. A movement that was too rhythmic to be an animal. Deep in the throat of the canyon, nestled under a natural rock overhang, sat a cluster of high-tech tents and a mobile satellite array. Armed men in white winter camouflage moved between the structures with practiced military precision. Michael's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a search party. It was a black site operation. And in the center of the camp he saw a small, shivering figure huddled in a cage, a young girl no older than 10, her eyes wide with a terror that Michael recognized all too well. Tom let out a sound that was barely a whisper, a mournful vibration of grief and fury. Michael looked at the dog, then back at the camp. The mission was no longer a mystery. It was a rescue. The world had reduced itself to the agonizing rhythm of breath and bone. Michael plunged his leaden legs into the white abyss, the snow now reaching his mid-thighs, a cold, suffocating blanket that sought to swallow him whole. Every step was a calculated battle against gravity and the numbing inertia of the frost. The pine trees around him were no longer mere plants. They were skeletal sentinels, their heavy snow-laden boughs bowing like mourners in a funeral procession. The air was so thin and sharp, it felt like inhaling pulverized glass, scouring his lungs with every desperate gasp. Above the sky was a bruised sheet of slate, offering no warmth, only the promise of a deeper, more lethal freeze. Tom moved through the drifts with a supernatural grace that bordered on the infuriating. The dog was a ghost of silver and shadow, his paws barely seeming to touch the treacherous surface that Michael found so punishing. Occasionally, the beast would pause, his powerful neck muscles tensing as he scanned the horizon with amber eyes that held a terrifying level of intelligence. He didn't bark. He didn't whimper. He simply waited for Michael to close the gap, a silent commander leading a broken soldier toward a destination that felt increasingly like a hallucination. Michael's vision began to blur at the edges, the monochromatic landscape bleeding into a hazy smear of gray and white. Doubt began to fester in the dark corners of Michael's mind. His muscles screamed in a chorus of protest, a burning lactic acid fire that the sub-zero temperatures could not quench. Was he truly chasing a lead, or was he following a grief-stricken animal into a frozen grave? The memory of the girl in the cage glimpsed from the ridge earlier felt like a fever dream. The high-tech camp, the armed men, the clinical cruelty of it all seemed impossible in this primal wilderness. He wondered if his mind, fractured by years of isolation, and the sudden surge of adrenaline was finally snapping under the pressure of the mountain. Yet every time his knees buckled, he saw the tuft of Tom's tail disappearing behind another thicket, and the primal urge to survive, to protect, pushed him forward. The silence of the woods was absolute, a heavy pressurized quiet that made the thumping of his heart sound like a drum in a cathedral. The wind had died down to a low, mournful whistle weaving through the needles of the ancient pines. Michael could no longer feel his toes. The sensation had been replaced by a dull wooden weight. He focused on the back of his hands, his skin cracked and red despite the gloves, and forced himself to count his steps. 1, 2, 3, 10 more yards, just 10 more yards. The forest seemed to stretch and warp, the trees leaning inward, as if trying to whisper secrets he wasn't meant to hear. Hours bled into an indeterminate sludge of time. The light was failing, the shadows of the trees stretching out like long, grasping fingers across the snow. Just as Michael felt his last reserve of strength evaporating, Tom stopped. They had reached the crest of a steep, jagged slope that overlooked a small, sheltered basin. The dog didn't look back this time. He stood perfectly still, his ears pricked forward, a low, guttural vibration emanating from his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but a signal of arrival. Michael collapsed to his knees at the edge of the ridge, his breath coming in ragged, steaming clouds. Tom threw his head back and let out a single, echoing bark. The sound shattered the silence of the basin, bouncing off the rock faces and vibrating through Michael's very marrow. Michael wiped the frost from his eyelashes and squinted into the gloom below. There, nestled between two massive ancient pines that looked like the pillars of a forgotten temple, sat a small, ramshackle cabin. It was a miserable structure of rotting logs and corrugated metal, half buried under the drifting snow. It looked as though it hadn't seen a human inhabitant in decades, a relic of a time when men tried and failed to conquer this peak. But then Michael saw it. A thin, almost invisible ribbon of pale blue smoke was curling upward from the rusted, crooked chimney. It was a fragile sign of life, a defiant wisp against the encroaching night. His heart, which had been sluggish with cold, suddenly surged with a frantic heat. Someone was inside, but as he slid down the slope, tumbling and crashing through the brush, until he reached the clearing of the cabin, a new chill took hold of him, one that had nothing to do with the weather. The heavy timber door of the cabin was not just closed, it was barricaded. A thick, rusted iron chain was wrapped multiple times around the external handles, secured with a heavy industrial-grade padlock that was crusted with ice. The windows were boarded up from the outside, with jagged planks of wood. This wasn't a shelter meant to keep the cold out. It was a prison designed to keep something or someone in. The smoke continued to rise, a silent scream for help from a tomb locked from the outside. Michael reached out a trembling hand to touch the cold iron, the realization of what lay behind the wood hitting him like a physical blow. The clearing was a dead space where the wind seemed to lose its voice, trapped within a circle of skeletal trees that groaned under the weight of the mountain snow. The cabin stood at the center like a festering wound, a structure of grayed timber and rusted iron that leaned precariously to one side. It was a place where time had not just stopped but had begun to rot. Michael stood at the edge of the clearing, his boots sinking deep into the drifts. The silence here was heavy, thick with the smell of wet wood, old ash, and something sharper, the metallic tang of neglect, and the cloying scent of long-term illness. It was the smell of a place where life was being squeezed out, drop by drop. Michael reached for the holster at his hip. His fingers, stiff with cold, found the familiar grip of his sidearm. He didn't draw it yet, but the contact grounded him. The soldier inside him, the man who had cleared compounds in desert heat and navigated urban ruins, took control. He began a slow, deliberate circle of the cabin, his eyes scanning for tripwires, cameras, or any sign of a sentry. There was nothing but the rhythmic thud of snow falling from the branches and the frantic, shallow breathing of Tom, who stood by the door, his tail tucked, but his eyes fixed on the entrance, with an intensity that was almost frightening. The barricade on the door was an insult to the very idea of a home. The iron chain was thick, each link coated in a layer of orange rust and frosted ice, wrapped so tightly around the handles that the wood had begun to splinter under the pressure. The padlock was a heavy industrial beast, its keyhole choked with grime. Michael stepped onto the sagging porch, the wood screaming under his weight. He looked at the boarded-up windows, the jagged planks nailed with a frantic, messy violence. This was not a security measure to keep thieves out. It was a cage designed to ensure that whatever was inside could never, ever escape. He holstered his weapon and looked around for a tool. Near the base of the chimney he found a discarded fire axe, its head rusted but its edge still wickedly sharp. Michael gripped the handle, feeling the rough grain of the wood. He took a deep breath, the freezing air burning his lungs, and swung. The first blow against the padlock sent a jarring vibration up his arms, the sound of metal hitting metal echoing through the trees like a gunshot. He swung again and again, his muscles burning with the effort, his focus narrowing down to the point of impact. On the fourth strike, the shackle of the lock snapped with a high-pitched ping, and the heavy chain slid to the porch floor with a hollow, clattering thud. Michael kicked the door. It didn't budge at first, frozen shut by ice, and the weight of the despair behind it. He threw his shoulder against the timber once, twice, until the frame groaned and gave way. The door swung open on complaining hinges, revealing a maw of darkness that smelled of unwashed bodies, medicinal bitterness, and the cold, stale air of a tomb. Michael drew his pistol, the tactical light mounted beneath the barrel, cutting a sharp white path through the gloom. Dust motes danced in the beam like tiny ghosts. The interior was a chaotic mess of overturned furniture, stained blankets, and empty tin cans. As the light swept across the room, it landed on a rusted iron bed frame in the far corner. Michael's breath hitched in his throat. A woman lay there, or what remained of one. She was draped in tattered wool blankets that were gray with age. Her face was a landscape of deep lines, and translucent skin stretched so tight over her cheekbones that she looked like a living skull. Her hair was a wild, matted halo of white. She was so thin that her body barely made a silhouette beneath the covers. Michael moved closer, his boots crunching on broken glass, and then he saw the final horror. A heavy steel cuff was locked around her skeletal wrist, the other end bolted firmly to the iron headboard of the bed. The woman's eyes fluttered open as the light hit her. They were a clouded, milky blue, wandering aimlessly until they found Michael. She didn't scream. She didn't have the strength. A low, rattling wheeze escaped her throat, a sound that was half gasp, half sob. Michael lowered his gun, his heart hammering against his ribs. The professional coldness he had maintained since the crash shattered, replaced by a wave of raw, sickening realization. This was Sarah. This was the reason for the journey, the reason for the blood on the snow, and the reason for the dog's desperate trek across the mountain. Tom didn't wait for Michael's permission. The dog let out a sound that tore through the room, a whimpering, crying howl of pure, unadulterated grief and joy. He leapt onto the bed, his large paws, careful not to crush the fragile form of the woman. He didn't bark. He simply pressed his large, warm head against her shoulder and began to lick her hand with a frantic, rhythmic devotion. The woman's fingers gnarled like the roots of the trees outside, twitched and slowly, painfully rose to rest on the dog's wet fur. A single tear tracked through the grime on her cheek, leaving a clean path of salt and sorrow. Michael stood frozen, the heavy axe still in his hand, watching the reunion in the heart of the wilderness. He realized then that Tom hadn't just been looking for a savior, he had been looking for a witness. The dog had known he couldn't break the chains himself, but he had refused to let his mistress die alone in the dark. The sheer scale of the cruelty that had put her here began to sink in, turning Michael's shock into a cold, hard rage. He looked at the bolt holding the cuff to the bed. He looked at the woman's fading pulse, visible in her neck. He knew they were out of time. The storm was returning, and the people who had built this prison were likely not far behind. He knelt by the bed, his shadow stretching long and jagged against the peeling wallpaper. He reached out and gently touched the woman's shoulder. She turned her head toward him, her gaze sharpening for a brief, lucid second. She didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask how he found them. She simply whispered a single word, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves, "Please." Michael nodded, his jaw set in a grim line. He wouldn't just free her from the bed. He would burn this entire nightmare to the ground if he had to. But first, he had to get her out before the forest claimed them all. The air inside the cramped cabin was thick with the scent of pine resin, stale sweat, and the metallic tang of old blood. Michael worked with a focused intensity, his hands steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had managed to pry the rusted shackle from Sarah's wrist, using a heavy iron poker he found by the hearth, but the damage was extensive. Her skin was a map of deep purple bruising and raw weeping sores, where the cold metal had bitten into her flesh for weeks. He used a clean strip of cloth from his own pack, soaked in melted snow to gently dab away the grime. Every time he touched her, Sarah let out a thin, whistling breath that sounded like wind through a cracked window. Tom sat like a stone sentinel by the heavy oak door. The dog's ears were pressed flat against his skull, and his gaze never wavered from the threshold. Occasionally, his shoulders would ripple with a low, involuntary tremor, a physical manifestation of the trauma he had endured to lead Michael here. The fire in the small hearth was dying, the embers glowing like the eyes of a cornered beast, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the peeling wallpaper and the stacks of rotting newspapers piled in the corners. While Sarah drifted into a shallow, pained sleep, Michael's gaze fell upon a small, leather-bound book resting on a scarred wooden table near the bed. It was out of place in the squalor of the room. Its cover was well maintained, though the pages within were swollen with moisture. He reached out and pulled it toward him. As he flipped open the first page, the name Dylan was scrawled in a sharp, aggressive hand. It wasn't a journal of memories. It was a ledger of cruelty, a meticulously recorded descent into madness and greed. The early entries spoke of frustration and a perceived inheritance that was taking too long to materialize. Michael's eyes scanned the jagged lines, his jaw tightening with every word. Dylan, the woman's own grandson, had discovered that the land beneath this cabin sat atop a massive vein of rare earth minerals. The mountain wasn't just dirt and rock. It was a fortune waiting to be bled dry. But Sarah had refused to sell. She had lived on this ridge her entire life, and she knew that the mining process would poison the valley below. To her, the land was a legacy. To Dylan, it was a payday that his grandmother was standing in the way of. Michael turned the pages faster now, his breath hitching in his chest. The entries became darker, more violent. Dylan described the day he had finally snapped, dragging the old woman to this remote outpost and chaining her to the bed like a common animal. He had hoped the cold and the isolation would break her spirit, forcing her to sign the deeds over to him. But Sarah had been stronger than he anticipated. She had endured the hunger, the freezing nights, and the psychological torment with a silent, iron-willed defiance, that had only served to fuel Dylan's rage. Then, Michael found the section regarding Tom. His heart hammered against his ribs as he read Dylan's descriptions of the dog. Tom had been Sarah's only defender. On the night Dylan had tried to force her hand to a legal document, the dog had lunged, tearing into the man's leg. The diary shifted into a visceral account of the retribution Dylan had meted out. He had beaten Tom with a heavy iron pipe, laughing as the dog crawled away into the snow, leaving a trail of red behind him. Dylan had left the dog for dead in the blizzard, convinced that no creature could survive the mountain's winter with such injuries. Michael looked over at Tom. The dog turned his head, his brown eyes meeting Michael's. In that moment, Michael saw the depth of the animal's soul, the unwavering loyalty that had driven a broken, bleeding creature to walk miles through a killing storm just to find help. Tom hadn't run away to save himself. He had run to save her. The realization hit Michael like a physical blow. He wasn't just dealing with a family dispute. He was in the lair of a monster who had discarded his humanity for the sake of mineral rights and cold hard cash. The silence of the cabin was suddenly shattered by a low, guttural growl. Michael dropped the diary and stood up, reaching for the heavy axe he had leaned against the wall. Tom was no longer sitting. He was crouched low to the ground, his hackles raised in a jagged line down his spine. His upper lip curled back, revealing long white fangs that glistened in the firelight. A deep, resonant snarl vibrated through the floorboards, a sound of pure, predatory warning. Then Michael heard it. At first, it was just a faint hum, a vibration in the air that could have been the wind, but it grew louder, more rhythmic, the mechanical scream of an engine echoing off the surrounding peaks. A bright artificial light suddenly cut through the gaps in the cabin's boarded-up windows, sweeping across the room like a searchlight. The roar of a high-powered snowmobile filled the clearing outside the engine, idling with a heavy, confident thrum. The hunter had returned to his trap. Dylan was back, and he wasn't alone. Michael felt the cold air seeping through the cracks of the door, and for the first time since he had entered the mountain, he didn't feel the chill. He felt the white-hot heat of a man who had seen enough evil for one lifetime. He gripped the handle of the axe until his knuckles turned white, his eyes fixed on the door that was about to burst open. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one that was about to break inside this room. The roar of the snowmobile engine died abruptly, leaving a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight pressing against the cabin walls. Outside, the wind whistled through the jagged peaks, but inside, the only sound was the rhythmic, low-frequency growl vibrating in Tom's chest. Michael stood in the center of the room, his boots planted firmly on the creaking floorboards, the heavy, wood-splitting axe held at his side. He watched the door, his eyes narrowed, his breath coming in slow, controlled cycles. The orange glow from the fireplace cast long, dancing shadows that stretched toward the entrance, making the room feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Footsteps crunched on the frozen porch, heavy, arrogant strides that spoke of a man who believed he owned the mountain and everything on it. The door handle rattled, then turned with a sharp click. The door swung open, bringing with it a swirl of crystalline snow and a blast of frigid air that made the fire in the hearth flicker violently. Dylan stepped inside his expensive winter gear, shimmering with frost. He was laughing, a cold, hollow sound, as he shook the snow from his shoulders. He didn't see Michael at first. His eyes were fixed on the corner where his mother lay. Dylan began to speak, his voice dripping with a cruel, mocking pity, telling her that the paperwork was ready and that her stubbornness would finally come to an end tonight. But the words died in his throat when he looked up. He froze, his gloved hand still clutching the door frame. His gaze shifted from the stranger holding the axe to the floor where the dog he thought he had left for dead stood snarling. Tom's teeth were bared, his eyes glowing with an ancient predatory hatred. The color drained from Dylan's face, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. The silence lasted only a second before it shattered. Dylan reached into the pocket of his heavy coat, his movements frantic and desperate. Michael didn't wait to see what he was reaching for. He lunged forward, the axe discarded for the moment, as he tackled Dylan with the full force of his momentum. They crashed against the wall, the impact sending a shiver through the entire structure. The shelves rattled, and a collection of old tin cans tumbled to the floor with a series of sharp metallic clangs. Dylan was not a fighter, but he was a man driven by the primal fear of a cornered rat. He swung a heavy flashlight like a club, catching Michael across the temple. White light exploded in Michael's vision, and the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. He stumbled back, his head ringing, but his grip on Dylan's collar didn't loosen. They grappled in the center of the room, a chaotic blur of limbs and heavy breathing. Dylan kicked out his heavy boots, striking Michael's shins, trying to create enough space to draw the small handgun tucked into his waistband. As they spun near the small wooden table, Michael's shoulder slammed into the upright post that held the kerosene lamp. The glass reservoir shattered against the floor, and the flame from the wick met the pooling oil instantly. A low whoosh echoed through the room as a wall of orange fire erupted between the two men. The heat was immediate and intense, a searing wave that singed the hair on Michael's arms. The dry, aged wood of the floorboards, hungry for fuel, began to blacken and curl as the fire spread with terrifying speed. The cabin, once a sanctuary of cold silence, was transformed into a roaring furnace. Thick, acrid smoke began to billow toward the ceiling, obscuring the rafters and making every breath a struggle. Dylan scrambled backward, his eyes wide with terror as he watched the flames lick the walls. He forgot about the gun, forgot about the land, forgot about everything except the heat that was beginning to blister the air. He tried to bolt for the door, but the fire had already claimed the rug and the heavy curtains, creating a barrier of dancing red light. In the corner, Sarah cried out, her voice thin and raspy as the smoke began to fill her lungs. Michael looked at the fire, then at the woman, and then at Dylan. The greed in Dylan's eyes had been replaced by a coward's desperation. Seeing an opening, Dylan grabbed a heavy chair and swung it at Michael, hoping to knock him into the flames. But Tom was faster. The dog launched himself from the shadows, a streak of fur and fury. His jaws clamped down on Dylan's forearm, the force of the bite tearing through the thick fabric of the coat. Dylan screamed, a high-pitched, pathetic sound that was lost in the roar of the fire. Michael ignored them both, his focus entirely on the frail woman in the bed. He tore a blanket from the wall and soaked it with the last of the water from a nearby pitcher. He threw the damp cloth over his head and shoulders and plunged through the growing wall of fire. The heat was an physical barrier, a wall of needles pricking every inch of his skin. He reached the bed and scooped Sarah up in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, a ghost of a person held together by sheer will. He turned back the exit, now almost entirely obscured by a curtain of falling sparks and burning timber. The ceiling groaned, the heavy main beam beginning to sag under the weight of the fire. Dylan was still struggling with Tom, kicking at the dog's ribs, his face contorted in a mask of agony and rage. He managed to shake the dog off and lunge toward Michael, his fingers clawing at the blanket, covering Sarah, a final spiteful attempt to drag them both down into the hell he had created. But the mountain was finished with Dylan. A massive section of the loft floor, weakened by the heat, gave way with a sound like a thunderclap. Michael Femmel felt the rush of air as the structure collapsed behind him. He didn't look back. He sprinted for the door, his boots thudding against the charred floorboards that threatened to give way at any second. He burst through the entrance, the cold night air hitting him like a physical blow. He didn't stop until he was 20 yards away, collapsing into the deep snow. He turned his head just in time to see the cabin's roof cave in, sending a pillar of sparks and ash high into the midnight sky. The screams from inside were cut short, replaced by the crackling of the timber and the soft hiss of snow melting against the heat. Tom emerged from the shadows a moment later, his fur singed, limping slightly but alive. He walked over to Michael and Sarah, letting out a soft whine as he nudged Michael's hand with his cold nose. Michael held Sarah tight, her breath coming in shallow gasps against his neck. The orange glow of the fire reflected in the snow, painting the white landscape in shades of blood and gold. The silence of the mountain returned, but this time it was different. The predator was gone, and in the ruins of the cabin the secrets of the past were finally being reduced to ash. Michael looked up at the stars, the cold air stinging his lungs, and felt a strange, hollow peace. He had come to this mountain looking for a story, but he had found a battle for a soul. As the fire began to die down, leaving only a glowing skeleton of the cabin against the dark pines, he knew that the long night was finally over. He reached out and stroked Tom's head, the dog's warmth, a reminder that even in the heart of a storm, Loyalty was the only thing that could never be burned away. The roar of the inferno had faded into a rhythmic, predatory crackle. The cabin was no longer a home or a hideout. It was a skeletal cage of blackened timber collapsing under its own weight. Michael moved through the knee-deep snow, his legs feeling like leaden weights. Every breath he took tasted of soot and bitter pine. He carried Sarah with a desperate gentleness, her frail body nearly weightless in his arms, wrapped in the heavy, singed wool of the old coat she had refused to leave behind. He found a clearing under the wide protective boughs of an ancient cedar tree, far enough from the heat of the fire, but close enough to see the orange glow dancing on the white landscape. He lowered her onto a bed of fresh snow, stripping off his own tactical jacket to create a barrier between her and the frozen ground. Tom the dog hovered close, his breath coming in white plumes, his tail tucked low as he licked Michael's hand, before settling down beside the old woman to offer her his warmth. The silence of the mountain felt heavy, now a vacuum created by the sudden absence of Dylan's screams and the crashing of the walls. Only the soft hiss of snowflakes landing on the glowing embers broke the stillness. Sarah's eyelids fluttered her skin, appearing translucent in the flickering light of the dying fire. She looked smaller than she had inside the cabin, a delicate bird broken by a storm she never asked for. Her lips moved dry and cracked, whispering words that were at first lost to the wind. Michael leaned in close, his ear inches from her mouth. He expected a plea for help or a cry of pain, but the name she uttered stopped the blood in his veins. "David," she whispered. "David, you came back for me. I knew you would." Michael pulled back, his brow furrowed in confusion. The name David resonated in the hollows of his mind, a ghost of a memory from his childhood. He watched her hand, gnarled by age and cold, reach out to clutch the front of her tattered coat. She wasn't just holding it. She was guarding it. Even in her semi-conscious state, her fingers gripped a specific section of the inner lining, her knuckles white with the effort. He noticed a strange stiffness in that part of the garment, a rectangular bulge that didn't match the flow of the fabric. Curiosity, sharpened by the adrenaline still coursing through him, drove his hand toward the seam. As his fingers brushed the wool, Sarah let out a soft, pained moan, her eyes remaining closed. He found a place where the stitching was uneven, hand-sewn with a thick, dark thread that had survived decades of wear. Using the small blade from his belt, Michael carefully sliced through the thread, his heart hammering against his ribs. Inside the hidden pocket, protected by a layer of oilcloth, lay a thick bundle of papers. The edges were yellowed with age, the scent of old parchment and drawn old lavender wafting up as he unfolded them. He held the documents toward the light of the burning cabin. The top page was a legal deed, the ink faded but still legible. His eyes scanned the cursive script, moving past the legal jargon until they hit the names of the property owners. Sarah Miller, and beside it in a bold, familiar hand, David Michael Vance. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Michael stared at the name, his breath hitching. David Michael Vance was his grandfather, the man who had raised him, the man who had died with a quiet, unexplained sorrow in his eyes. Michael remembered the old photograph his grandfather kept in a silver locket, a picture of a young woman with laughing eyes and a crown of wildflowers. He had always asked who she was, but his grandfather would only shake his head and say, "She was the one the mountain took." He dug deeper into the bundle. There was a marriage license never filed, dated 50 years ago. There were letters, dozens of them tied with a piece of blue ribbon. He opened one, his eyes blurring as he read the opening lines. "My dearest Sarah, the house is almost finished. By the time the first snow falls, we will be husband and wife. I count the days until I can call you mine." It was signed with his grandfather's unmistakable signature. The realization hit him like an avalanche. Sarah wasn't just a victim of Dylan's greed. She was the missing piece of his own history. She was the woman his grandfather had waited for every day of his life, the fiancée who had supposedly vanished during a winter storm while traveling to meet him. The story said she had died in the cold, but the reality was far more sinister. She had been here, held captive or hidden away by some dark family secret that Dylan had been willing to kill to keep buried. Michael looked down at Sarah, his eyes brimming with a mixture of rage for what she had lost and a profound, aching sadness. He reached out and gently stroked her silver hair, brushing away the snowflakes. "You're not alone, Sarah," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm David's grandson. I'm here. I've got you." Sarah's eyes opened, then clear and blue for a fleeting second. She looked at Michael, really looked at him, seeing the familiar line of his jaw and the shape of his eyes, features he had inherited from the man she had loved. A small, trembling smile touched her lips. "David," she breathed, her voice a mere thread of sound. "You look just like him." Suddenly, Tom stood up, his ears pricking toward the dark sky. He let out a loud, rhythmic bark, his tail wagging furiously. From the distance over the crest of the jagged peaks, a low, rhythmic thumping began to grow. It wasn't the wind, it was the sound of heavy rotors cutting through the thin mountain air. A beam of white light cut through the falling snow, sweeping across the blackened ruins of the cabin like the finger of God. The rescue helicopter descended, its searchlight blindingly bright against the white expanse. The downdraft sent a whirlwind of snow and ash swirling around them, but Michael didn't move. He shielded Sarah's body with his own, holding her tight as the rescuers began to rappelling down from the hovering machine. As the medics rushed toward them with stretchers and thermal blankets, Michael looked back at the fire one last time. The cabin was gone, and with it the secrets that had haunted 2 generations. He felt the weight of the papers in his hand, a legacy restored. The mountain had tried to keep Sarah Miller, but destiny had sent a Vance to bring her home. The long night was over. The cold still bit at his skin, but as the medics took Sarah from his arms, she squeezed his hand one last time. The cycle of grief that had started 50 years ago was finally broken. Under the shadow of the peaks, amidst the ruins and the snow, the truth had finally been pulled from the ashes. The winter that had once threatened to swallow Michael Vance and Sarah Miller whole had finally retreated into the high crevices of the Bitterroot Mountains. In its wake, a Montana spring arrived with an almost aggressive vibrance. The valley floor was no longer a monochrome wasteland of white and gray. It was a riot of emerald green, punctuated by the sudden defiant blooms of yellow glacier lilies and purple lupines. The air, which had for months been a razor of cold that cut deep into the lungs, was now soft and fragrant with the scent of damp cedar thawing earth and the sweet resinous sap of the pines. High above the jagged peaks still wore caps of brilliant white snow, but the lower slopes were alive with the sound of rushing water. The creeks were swollen, tumbling over moss-covered stones, with a frantic, joyful energy carrying the last remnants of the ice toward the distant rivers. It was a season of resurrection, a time when the earth reclaimed its strength, and for the first time in years, Michael felt as though he were part of that cycle rather than a ghost haunting its edges. The new cabin stood on the same ground where the old one had burned, but it was a different creature entirely. Where the previous structure had been a fortress of solitude and shadow, this one was built with wide windows that invited the sunlight to linger on the polished wood floors. The scent of fresh-cut timber still clung to the walls, a clean and honest smell that spoke of hard work and new beginnings. On the wide front porch, a rocking chair moved with a slow, rhythmic creak that harmonized with the morning birdsong. Sarah Miller sat in that chair, a thick wool blanket draped over her legs, despite the warmth of the sun. Her recovery had been a slow, arduous journey that many had doubted she would survive. The night on the mountain had taken a toll on her frail frame, but her spirit had proven to be made of the same unyielding granite as the peaks themselves. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her skin, though etched with the deep lines of a century lived, had regained a healthy, sun-kissed glow. She watched the horizon, not with the hollow gaze of a woman waiting for the end, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had finally come home. In the meadow below the porch, the silence was broken by a sudden, exuberant bark. Tom, the German shepherd who had survived the fire and the frost, was no longer the weary, shivering animal Michael had first encountered. His coat was thick and glossy, his muscles lean and powerful as he bounded through the tall grass. He was chasing a tennis ball, or perhaps just his own shadow, his tail wagging with a fervor that seemed to vibrate through his entire body. He was a dog who had forgotten the weight of the world, living entirely in the golden perfection of the present moment. Michael Vance stood in the center of the clearing, his feet planted firmly in the soil. He looked different than the man who had arrived in Montana months ago. The haunted, hollowed-out look in his eyes had been replaced by a steady, quiet clarity. He was wearing a simple flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing the scars on his forearms, marks of his service that he no longer felt the need to hide. He watched Tom with a faint, genuine smile, a soundless laugh shaking his chest as the dog performed a clumsy, joyous somersault in pursuit of a butterfly. Michael walked back toward the porch, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. He carried 2 mugs of steaming coffee, the steam curling upward in the still morning air. He handed one to Sarah, their fingers brushing briefly, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in the crucible of the mountain. They didn't need many words anymore. They had shared a history that spanned generations, a story of loss and redemption that was now etched into the very land they stood upon. Sarah took a slow sip of the coffee, her blue eyes twinkling as she looked at Michael. "You have that look again," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The look of a man who is thinking too much about the future." Michael leaned against the porch railing, looking out over the thousands of acres of pristine wilderness that stretched out before them. "I was just thinking about the lawyers," he admitted. "And the men in the suits who keep calling from the mining companies, they offered another 10% this morning. They really want this valley, Sarah." Sarah's expression didn't waver. She set her mug down on the small table beside her and looked at the forest where the ancient pines stood like silent sentinels. "They see gold and minerals, Michael. They see profit margins and quarterly reports. They don't see the way the light hits the creek at sunset. They don't see the tracks of the grizzly or the history of the people who bled for this dirt." Michael nodded, a hard line of resolve forming in his jaw. "I told them no. I told them there isn't enough money in the world to buy a single inch of this place." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment. It was the official charter for the David and Sarah Foundation. They had spent the last few months working with conservationists and veteran outreach programs to create something that would outlast them both. The land would be legally protected as a wildlife corridor, a sanctuary for the animals that Sarah had spent her life defending. But more than that, the cabin and the surrounding forest would serve as a retreat for veterans, men and women like Michael, who had returned from the darkness of war and didn't know how to find the light again. The foundation would provide a place where they could work the land, care for the animals, and find the quiet they needed to heal. It was a legacy for David, the man who had never come home from the war, and for Sarah, the woman who had waited for him in the shadows of the mountains. It was a way to turn their tragedy into a bridge for others. Michael looked at the signature line at the bottom of the document. He would sign it today, ensuring that this valley would remain wild and sacred forever. "I think David would have liked this," Michael whispered, his voice thick with a sudden surge of emotion. Sarah reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "David would have loved you, Michael. He would have seen the man you've become, and he would have been proud to call you his own. You didn't just save me from that mountain, son. You saved his memory. You brought him home." Michael felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even realized he was carrying. The ghosts of the past were no longer screaming. They were finally at peace. Tom came trotting up the porch steps, his tongue lolling out of his mouth as he panted happily. He nudged Michael's hand with his wet nose, demanding attention. Michael laughed and knelt down, burying his face in the dog's thick fur. The smell of the dog, earth, sun, and life was the most grounding thing he had ever known. He remembered the night in the snow, the way Tom's warmth had been the only thing keeping him from drifting into the final sleep. He realized then that the narrative he had told himself was wrong. He had spent months thinking he was the hero of the story, the brave soldier who had trekked through a blizzard to save a helpless old woman and a stray dog. But as he felt Tom's heart beating against his chest and saw the peace in Sarah's eyes, the truth settled into his soul. He hadn't saved them. He had been a man drowning in his own trauma, lost in a world that no longer made sense. It was the dog's loyalty and the woman's resilience that had pulled him from the depths. They had given him a reason to fight, a reason to care, and finally, a reason to stay. The sun began to dip toward the western peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple gold and deep, fiery orange. The shadows of the pines stretched long across the meadow, but they were no longer frightening. They were just part of the landscape, part of the natural rhythm of a world that was healing. Michael stood up and looked out at his kingdom, not a kingdom of wealth, but of life and purpose. He saw a hawk circling in the thermal currents, a solitary hunter in a sky that went on forever. He turned back to Sarah, who was watching the sunset with a quiet smile. "Are you ready to go inside?" he asked. "The air is starting to get a bit of a chill." Sarah nodded, but she didn't move immediately. She took one last look at the horizon, at the mountains that had been her prison and were now her sanctuary. "Yes, Michael, I'm ready. We have a lot of work to do tomorrow." Michael helped her up, and together the three of them, the soldier, the survivor, and the dog, walked toward the door of the cabin. As Michael closed the door, he felt a profound sense of finality. The war was over. Not the one in the distant deserts, but the one that had been raging inside him for years. He had found a place where he belonged, a legacy to protect, and a family that didn't require blood to be real. He looked at Tom, who had already claimed a spot on the rug in front of the hearth, and realized the greatest irony of his journey. Sometimes we think we are the ones rescuing the broken, but in the end, it is the act of saving them that truly saves us.